Hey everyone, welcome to part one of the Age of Reagan. Our questions to think about here: why did Ronald Reagan win the 1980 presidential election? And what were the main ideas of President Reagan's economic program? How successful was it? So beginning here with the presidential election of 1980, President Carter had used the Watergate trauma to win the presidency, but he found himself in serious trouble. The economy was terrible. Inflation had reached double digits, and the recession was worse. Unemployment had climbed to nearly 8% by July 1980. Ronald Reagan believed that there were simple answers to complex problems, but they would not necessarily be easy answers. He pledged to increase military spending, to bring America's prestige abroad back, and to dismantle the bloated federal government and to reduce taxes and regulations. Carter tried to portray Ronald Reagan as a warmonger, but Reagan's greatest hit in the campaign was the question, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And the answer for most Americans was a resounding no. Reagan had told his supporters that there was, quote, a hunger in this land for a spiritual revival. The United States, he declared, remained, quote, the greatest country in the world. We have the talent, we have the drive, we have the imagination. Now all we need is the leadership. And given the state of the economy in 1980, the vast majority of Americans who voted in this election agreed with him. Reagan's presidency is going to be helped along by the fact that the Republicans take control of the Senate. Now, the Democrats still control the House of Representatives, but their majority has narrowed significantly. And then there are two incidences that happen early on in Reagan's presidency that sort of endear him to much of the American public. The first relates to an incident that we didn't specifically talk about. We saw in 1979 American diplomats and personnel at the embassy in Tehran, in Iran, were taken hostage. And it's not until Ronald Reagan takes the oath of office in 1981 that these hostages are released. So they've been held for well over a year. And so this ends this long nightmare for many Americans. And then just a few months into his presidency, Ronald Reagan survives an assassination attempt. John Hinckley Jr. fired 6 shots at President Reagan, one of which punctured a lung and lodged near his heart. As he was being wheeled into the operating room, he jokingly told the doctor, Sir, I hope you're a Republican. And the doctor's response was, today we're all Republicans, sir. And so that sort of lightheartedness. And then during his recovery, he mentioned to his wife, Nancy, I'm sorry, honey, I forgot to duck. And that sort of lightheartedness, cheerfulness, really did endear him to much of the American public. When we take a look at Ronald Reagan's economic program, it really is a blast from the past. So think back to the 1920s and the Republican presidencies that we saw there. And under the guidance of Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon, we saw those Republican presidents embrace the idea of trickle-down economics or supply-side economics. Ronald Reagan is going to resurrect this idea. And it's basically following the same guidelines of what we saw in the 1920s, is you have huge, huge tax cuts for the wealthy. But Reagan is also going to throw in major budget cuts. And so many of the Great Society programs are going to be scaled back. Now, just a kind of a point of caution on understanding the numbers here. The spending on social programs, welfare programs in 1982 was $53 billion higher than it was in 1980. But that number represents $35 billion less than President Carter wanted it to be. So it's sort of a shrinking of growth in these programs rather than an absolute cut in these programs. Now, here's where President Reagan sort of steps away from the idea of supply side economics, and that is his massive increases in military spending. It's really interesting that President Reagan is going to take us sort of back to the days of containment. He very much uses this early Cold War rhetoric of good versus evil, and we'll get into that more later on. But this is actually an example of Keynesian economics, the opposite of supply-side economics. So the government is helping to stimulate the economy. And because he's reducing taxes for the wealthiest Americans, he's actually creating a huge budget deficit that is going to be unsustainable. And in fact, early on, the economy struggles very much. Economists had warned that cutting taxes would lead to these large deficits, but President Reagan was confident that his program would both stimulate the economy and reduce the role of the federal government. The massive increases in military spending lead to these soaring budget deficits, which triggers the worst economic recession since the 1930s, which I have called the Reagan Recession because he essentially causes this. And then to go back on some of his campaign promises, Reagan is forced to allow Congress to raise some taxes. But of course, we're not going to call these tax increases. We are instead going to call them revenue enhancements. But despite these changes, the poor economy persists throughout 1982, with unemployment standing at about 10.4%. Now, keep in mind that economists really would like to see unemployment around 3.5 to 4.5%. And we're looking at 10% unemployment. We actually saw this recently with the Great Recession beginning in 2008. Our unemployment rate had jumped to about 10%. And keep in mind that given the current situation of the coronavirus and the impact on the economy, we're going to see something very similar in this day and age. But the story shifts a little bit that by 1983, the economy begins to recover. Now, many conservative Republicans and those who are supportive of President Reagan's philosophy argue that trickle-down economics works. It doesn't. It still doesn't. Because when you consider that massive stimulus program of military spending, you could equally argue that Reagan's Keynesian economics stimulates the economy. Either way, the economy is going to improve, and that is going to be helpful moving forward, although we have this legacy of these huge budget deficits. The other thing that's really going to be concerning for President Reagan is the size and influence of the United States government. He wants to see the U.S. government much less involved in things like social welfare programs and regulation of different aspects of the economy. And so it's during Reagan's presidency that we see certain distinctions between savings banks and commercial banks that were put in by the New Deal taken away. And this, of course, is going to lead to questionable banking practices that are going to turn ugly later on. Just kind of a side note here, in the presidential election of 1984, Reagan is immensely popular. I mean, part of the problem with Jimmy Carter in the 1980 presidential election is that he was so gloomy and people were just tired of his preachiness about being frugal and turn down the heat and put on a sweater. That's not something that Americans want to hear. They want to hear that the economy is going to be coming back. And that's part of what made Ronald Reagan as a man so personable and attractive, is that he was cheerful. He had sort of an optimistic outlook. Like, it's probably going to be difficult, but we can do it. And we can make America great again. That was his campaign slogan in 1980. So coming into 1984, the economy has started to move once again. And Reagan's campaign slogan is, "America is back and standing tall." Quick side note here, Geraldine Ferraro of New York was the first female vice presidential candidate for the major party. But despite her presence on the ticket, the Democrats lose in a landslide. And the biggest reason, the biggest story of this election is the fact that the economy has improved. So coming back to questions to think about, why did Ronald Reagan win the 1980 presidential election? A lot of it had to do with the terrible economy this is something that Nixon struggled with. This is something that President Ford struggled with. It's something that President Carter struggled with. But the fact that President Carter was so negative, that he was so pessimistic about the future of the economy, it just really turned people off to his presidency. And then Ronald Reagan comes in, he's much more upbeat, much more optimistic, and he sort of brings back this idea of the United States has had some setbacks, let's sort of pick ourselves up and move forward. And that was a very appealing message to a lot of people. And then finally, what were the main ideas of President Reagan's economic program and how successful was it? Reaganomics is basically repackaged trickle-down economics or supply-side economics. Huge tax cuts for the wealthy and the idea that it trickles down to the rest of us. It doesn't really work. It didn't work in the 1920s, it didn't work in the 1980s, and it hasn't worked since 2016. And so what really jumpstarts the economy? Probably a combination of a lot of things, but the fact that the US government is pumping money into military spending as a Keynesian force definitely contributes. So stay tuned for part 2 of the Age of Reagan.